4 minutes after the time that we had advertised to start. So I think I'll just give people 1 more minute to get started, and then we'll before we start speaking, since we have some very busy speakers and guests here. By way of introduction, I'm Cindy Robinson. I'm joined here today by some of the members from the SAPAC board. John Chang is one I see. SAPAC is a Stanford Asian Pacific American alumni club, and we are a national alumni group. We do have some regional leaders in New York, LA, and other places. So we welcome everyone who's new to SAPAC, as well as those who are students and listening in. Our two guests today are Gloria Lee and Jane Kim. I found out last night that they are the entire 100% of the first graduating class of the Asian American Studies majors. So I'm really, really pleased that they stepped forward to share some of their insights and what it meant for them to make the decision to go into the major, and then what they've done with their glorious careers afterwards. So I'm going to end the poll and just ask everyone to be on mute until we get to the Q&A. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'll be monitoring the chat. And the reason we're doing that is because Jane has a hard stop at, I think, 6:30. So we want to make sure that we get through all of the planned remarks and then get to your questions. All right. Without further ado, I'm going to just ask that our speakers introduce themselves a little bit. So when you do that, Gloria and Jane, if you could help us put context into what was happening when you stepped on campus as a first-year student. Where were you from? What's your home life like? And what was going on campus and around the country in 1995 when you arrived at Stanford? I will ask Gloria to introduce herself first, and then we'll go to Jane.
Okay, sure. And Jane, I'm gonna punt to you what was happening in 1995 because I don't remember. So I feel like you'll have a better conversation on that point. But hello, everyone. Gloria Lee. As Cindy mentioned, Jane and I are the first graduating class of Stanford Asian American Studies majors. And it's crazy because we're both Korean Americans, but we both actually went to Berkeley for law school afterwards, albeit different years, but we've had such different paths. And Jane will tell, and Jane is a political figure, a public figure, so many of you probably know her from media and her campaigns, but, and I'll let her talk about herself. But for me, I practiced real estate law for the first 10 years and then became a chief business development officer for my law firm. And now I'm a venture partner at a fund. I serve on a public company board, as well as a co-founder of a biotech company. So a lot of different things, but all of them came from my Asian American kind of network connections involvement. And I'm so excited to share that story with you because I credit a lot of that to my Asian American Studies major and everything, the resources that Stanford afforded me. And kind of back to the original question, I'm from Anaheim, home of Disneyland. One of my friends who also went to Stanford was literally the Mickey Mouse at Disneyland. And I basically grew up in a middle income, community. It was primarily Latino, some whites, not that many Asians, maybe 10, 15%. And then I really didn't think that much about race growing up. But when I went to Stanford, I think that's when I had a lot of more self-actualization. I remember going to my roommate, was a very good looking Caucasian surfer guy, also from Orange County. And I remember thinking, like, he's better than me. Like, I'm like, why is he talking to me? And it was kind of the weirdest feeling, thinking that I was telling myself that I was inferior to someone else, even though we were both at the same campus and, from the same area. So I think that's like college is when I started thinking about my ethnic identity more, and I'll delve into that a little bit more throughout the conversation. Jane, over to you.
Hi, Gloria, good to see you. And thank you so much for having me this evening. Gosh, during the mid-90s, so I'll start with talking a little bit about myself and then why I decided to major in Asian American Studies. So I very differently came to Stanford knowing that I wanted to study some form of ethnic studies and preferably Asian American studies. So my first day on campus went straight to the AAPI seeking a job, was graciously hired by Cindy Ng and Rick Yoon at the time to be a community organizing, community building fellow, and went straight to work meeting student activists, leaders of ASA and MECHA and the Black Student Union, Native American House, to get engaged and involved in the final years of the fight for ethnic studies. So I got to join in the 25th year of the struggle for Asian American and Chicana studies. And it was the spring quarter of our sophomore year, Gloria and our sophomore year, that these programs began. And so really it was just a very exciting time in the sense that I got to be at the tail end of a 25-year struggle for this new program that finally took place. And we were the first graduating class to be able to major in Asian American studies. During this time, I think, the biggest events that I remember was not 1995, but was 1992 with Sayagu and the LA riots. And Gloria, you grew up in Southern California. I grew up in New York City. So I was watching the Rodney King verdict from afar and then watching Los Angeles, specifically South Central and Koreatown burn. And that was the year, this was my freshman year of high school, that I felt the need to speak out more about the issues of race inequity and race disparities, to be in solidarity with many of my friends who are African American and Latina, but also to speak about what it means to be an Asian American in the United States, a story and a voice that I rarely heard in the 80s and 90s. And it was during this time period that we were seeing increasing tensions grow between immigrant communities and existing communities of color. And I really started to engage in high school around a number of these issues, and joining student conferences and starting to read books by Malcolm X and Richard Wright, primarily Black American authors. And then near the end of my high school time, I was introduced to Ronald Tataki and Strangers for a Different Shore. So I knew coming to Stanford that public service was the work that I wanted to do, and that I wanted to hopefully be an ethnic studies or Asian American studies major while at Stanford. And, upon graduation, decided to pursue this career. So started out as a community organizer for 6 years, working for Chinatown Community Development Center in San Francisco. And then also working, I see Linda Tran here, who I think was a little sib for me. I forget exactly what the program is, but at the time, and she remembers this, I was also co-founding and coordinating an Asian American performance venue space in San Francisco to support emerging Asian American artists. And I remember Linda coming up to one of our events, and then eventually running for office, which was a somewhat unexpected turn in my career. I had never, ever thought I would run for office. In fact, I always thought elected officials were, that was a space that I was, too pure as an activist to go into, but ended up running for office, attending Berkeley Law School with Gloria, although a few years later, and then going on to serve for 12 years in San Francisco. After that, I served as the California political director for Senator Bernie Sanders in his 2020 presidential race. And now I'm serving as a California director for Working Families Party. I'm happy to talk more about that as we get more questions. But, want to go back to our moderator.
Thank you so much, Jane. So you knew you wanted to major in something like ethnic studies, preferably Asian American studies. I'm sure that you had a lot to do with shaping the major. So Gloria, what did you think you wanted to study, and why did you choose Asian American studies?
I don't know what I thought I was going to study on campus, but why I decided to major in it, I think a lot of students, they take that intro class, the Asian American Studies class. And I think that's when everything opened up for me. And I just love the interdisciplinary approach, right? For someone like me that was undecided, I definitely wanted to do something in the humanities or social sciences, but I didn't know what. I think that first course, just kind of blending the history, sociology, econ, psychology, like so many aspects was so fascinating in focusing on one topic. And then from there, I think I realized, oh, at the core, I'm a sociologist and the way I think about the world and where I like to study. So that's the study of human relationships and institutions. And so I think I primarily approached Asian American studies just because it was a personal interest of mine. And just to kind of give you a little bit more context. So I had a roommate who really wanted to do English literature. She was also Korean American from Southern California. But her parents were like, no, you went to Stanford, so you need to do like econ, computer science, hum bio. We sacrifice way too much for you to like, you know, become a starving writer or something like that. And I think she really struggled with that, right? And then she eventually went to law school, but I think she probably could have gone to a better law school if she just focused on her passions in English literature, is my opinion. For me, it was different because I paid my own way through college. I worked 20 hours a week, all 4 years, got 50 scholarships. My mom was like, okay. I mean, like she didn't even know what I majored in. I never really asked her. This is what I'm going to do. This is what I'm interested in. And I really didn't care what other people thought, you know. Through that process, I majored in other things. Like I think Jane and I are both, we both majored in Asian American studies and political science. And then I also did a psychology minor and I did a master's co-term in sociology. But again, I think I loved the fact that I was exposed to that interdisciplinary approach. And that's probably why I was really in tune with that.
Thanks for sharing that. So Gloria, you mentioned your roommate's parents not very open to a non-technical degree. Could either of you share with the group, what were the reactions of your family and friends when you decided to focus on Asian American studies and political science? Was there any pushback? Were there some great lessons that you wanted to share with them? Like, this is how much I'm learning. This is why I'm so passionate about what I'm doing. Jane?
Very similar to Gloria. My parents didn't ask me what I was majoring in. I also double majored in Asian American studies and political science. And my family was just thrilled that I got into and was attending Stanford University. It is true on my graduation day, my parents saw for the first time in the program booklet what I had majored in and attended my graduation sessions. And my father was disappointed that I decided to major in something that only 2 people chose to major in, and viewed that as maybe a sign that I was too extreme amongst my peers, and was very concerned about what I would do with the major. And my parents and I did struggle around my career choices. My business card when I graduated from Stanford literally said community organizer on, when we had paper business cards. And my parents had hoped, like many other Stanford parents, that their child would become a lawyer or a doctor. I assume now it's engineer and computer science programmer.
A founder or an entrepreneur.
Right. And we definitely struggled through most of my 20s in regards to my career choice. And I'm actually very honest about why I decided to ultimately go to law school. I waited 7 years between undergrad and attending Berkeley Law School because I didn't think I was actually going to go back to graduate school. I loved public service. I didn't feel that I necessarily needed to go to graduate school to do the work that I did. But I largely went because my parents and I fought so much about my career choices. And I felt that law school was a compromise for the work that I wanted to engage in, that it would be helpful for the work that I wanted to do. And it would also make my parents feel that I at least had a stable landing pad if my career didn't work out. What was actually really extraordinary was that my parents eventually became my biggest cheerleaders. It took close to 10 years. But once my parents saw me running for office and they got to read stories about me in the Korean newspaper and English language newspaper, and actually very symbolically when Barack Obama won the US presidency, they really shifted in how they felt about my career choices, and were really proud that I decided to serve my community and that I wanted to do good work. And, Barack Obama made community organizer a cool job to have. And I remember I was actually at home when Obama gave his victory speech after the Iowa caucus, because it was around January 3rd. So I was at home for the holidays. And I remember Barack Obama opening with the line of, "They said this day would never come." And I was crying in the living room. And my dad came in and he saw me crying. He saw Barack Obama. He knew that Barack ran as a community organizer turned attorney. And now he was potentially on his way to becoming US president. And my dad looked at me and he said, "I'm going to support Obama because Obama's going to open doors for you in the work that you want to do and in your career." And since then, my father passed away last year. My father became my biggest cheerleader. And it was a big evolution in our relationship. And I'm just so happy that we were able to transform our relationship in that way.
Wow, thank you for sharing that, Jane. That's very touching and really eye-opening. In terms of careers, it sounds like you were pursuing things. Your parents saw the light. I wanted to turn back to Gloria. Before we opened the session, she says, "I'm a very corporate person, not so academic, but you've done so many things, Gloria." Tell us a little bit about how the major transformed not only who you got to meet and work with, but how you translated what you were learning into what you were doing now, and then in the many facets of your career.
Yeah, I've always been so proud of Jane because she's kind of like that activist, public servant. But I also knew that I wasn't like that. I knew that I'm probably going to go into the corporate world, but I'm going to do the inside job, right? I'm going to make sure we get more Asian Americans and particularly women in the highest forms of leadership at companies and do things a different way. And we need people on both sides, right? So that's kind of that was my role, I think, in this evolution. But for me, I had children fairly young, and working the corporate ladder was very difficult. And I think the Asian American Studies major, just always understanding context, right? Like, for example, my parents came to the US, my mom thrived, my father did not. And then I think through the Asian American Studies lens, I realized, well, in Korea, there's more of a patriarchy. So the guys are going to have sort of the leg up, whereas they come to the US and it's a little bit more level playing field. Say you're a nurse or you have some kind of technical degree, you have opportunities. And then there are issues with the kind of power dynamics of gender, and just those kind of contexts helped me realize, like, okay, things are not just so black and white. So when I came into the law firm and saw, like, why are all the associates Asian or Latino, Black, and all the partners and equity leadership white, and just kind of seeing how things work. And then from the inside, I could change things and create programs and, suggest things, right? At the end of the day, in the corporate world, money talks. So I knew if I wanted to change things, I had to have the biggest book of business. And when they saw that and a lot of it was through my Asian American connections. I was president of the Orange County Asian American Bar Association. And part of that was because I wanted to talk to other Asian American women who are partners at firms, because we didn't have any. My firm was always ranked #1 worst in California, lowest women partners, lowest minority partners. But I kind of liked that because that was a challenge I wanted to take on, right? And so once I started building that network, I was going to leave the firm because it was so hard raising the kids, doing the business development and billing the hours. But the firm noticed, like, I had this ability to bring in business and said, "You know what, we would love for you to be the chief business development officer." And I loved it because here is this super white male firm, the oldest in Orange County, very conservative. And they're saying, "We're going to put this young mom as the face of our firm, have her go to all the events and represent us." And I just thought that was like a really cool, like, opportunity for me. And I think within 5 years, the face of our firm, or the reputation of our firm, really changed. Now we're known as, like, the most diverse, and, like, we have so many women, partners. And for example, most of the time you go golfing or to bars to do business development and network. I created, things where women could get involved, or like events where you could bring your children and just open up a little bit of doors. And I think, again, I love, and I'm so proud that I'm the person handing out the work to the older white male partners and say, I need that by 6 o'clock on Saturday morning, right? Or whatever it is. And I think that opportunity also gave me a chance to serve on other boards. So a lot of them were Asian American. Asian American Advancing Justice was one. I was on stage doing a fundraiser, much like I do for political candidates like Jane, kind of saying why we should all, donate to Asian Americans Advancing Justice at this time. I had shared a story about when Trump was running for office, and there was like a lot of political tension. Someone tried to hit me with their car while I was walking to work, and they rolled down the window and said, F you, go back to China. And I was just shocked, right? I was sharing the story. I think it really resonated with the room. And someone in the room saw me and basically was like, I don't know why, but I think we would really love to have you as our venture partner in our fund. We feel like you could, tell stories. You have a great network, and we'd love, to have you involved. And it's kind of like, well, that's something I've always wanted to be a venture capitalist. Didn't know what the path was, but really sort of my involvement with the Asian American community really facilitated that. I'm also on the board of the Council of Korean Americans. That's a national board primarily for like C-level executives throughout the country. And through that, I got to know someone named Gideon Yu, who's also an illustrious Stanford alumni. He was the Facebook and YouTube CFO that he took both companies public, became the first president of an NFL team of color, the San Francisco 49ers, and now is a co-owner. And I said to him, I would love to do a panel about Korean Americans in the NFL, because no one thinks we're athletic or are involved, right? He loved it and said, put it together. We got Mina Kimes of ESPN, who's half Korean, half white. We got Younghae Koo, who is the Pro Bowler kicker from the Falcons, who is an immigrant. We got Gideon Yu, Kim Pagula, who is an adoptee and Korean American. And we did this amazing panel. Through that, Gideon loved my working style and got to know me. And I had other connections through a board he served on. And I had an opportunity to then join the board of Hanmi Bank, a public company board, another aspiration that I've always had, but didn't know how to break in. And I realized again, it's not the particular seminar, but it's just these openings that if you follow your passions, how idiosyncratic and like random they are, I think people notice, and I think they see that sincerity and excitement, and opportunities come. So I just really attribute that to Asian American studies, and just not caring what people think about what you're doing, just kind of following what you're interested in. And maybe you don't have the game plan all together initially, but I'm so happy that I majored in Asian American studies. I think one thing I would say is, because we're at Stanford and you're an alumni, there's a baseline that people think you're somewhat smart, you have a little bit of credibility. So if you want to major in Italian classics, people are like, yeah, but they're still pretty smart, right? And you can throw in some CS classes and, econ classes in there, or double major, all of that. So I really say, if you're interested, like, go for it, because I think it will open a lot more doors than you realize. So that's a long-winded way to share my career path, but hopefully that was helpful.
Jane, were you moved to share some of your career path as well?
Well, I did really want to affirm what Gloria said about the importance of having folks that have majored in Asian American studies or are engaged in our community in multiple different sectors, because we're in a whole lot of trouble if we expect the nonprofit sector alone or government alone to solve a lot of the systematic issues that we have throughout our country. We need leaders that are engaged and care at the leadership, at our law firms, at our tech companies, just as we need them in governance as well. And it reminded me of a story of a legislation that I had worked on in my second year in office, called, many of you are familiar with this, but when you apply for a job or when you apply for even college, there's a box that you check if you've ever been arrested or convicted of a crime. This is something that has largely become passé, but 10 years ago was something that was on every single job application and higher education application. And so I had been approached by a group of attorneys that I used to work with at Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights to introduce a legislation that we eventually called the Fair Chance Act, which was to ban the box on applications and only permit employers to ask about conviction history, not arrest history, once you've had the first interview. So making sure that people at least had a chance to walk through the door if they were qualified and given an opportunity to meet in person and share their story and maybe even explain, why they happen to get convicted of a crime that would impact their future work. When I started, we had maybe 5 votes on the Board of Supervisors out of 11, and I needed 6 minimum to get it across through the board and 8 for it to become veto proof. And at the time, the mayor was not supportive of the ordinance. And the Chamber of Commerce heavily opposed it along with all other employer groups. But at the time, we decided to engage the small business and business community. And we sat and negotiated with them for a full year. And I had never done that with legislation, or we actually didn't even introduce it because we spent a year organizing around it. And one of the most amazing things that happened was that after the year that we spent sitting at the table, bringing individuals that had convictions on their record and weren't able to get jobs, weren't able to get housing, the Chamber of Commerce became our biggest advocate. And I still remember the day when the Chamber of Commerce president came to our committee to speak in support of the legislation. And he said, when I first read this legislation, I called it the fat chance I'll hire a convict legislation. And now, after spending a year working with former individuals with convictions on their record, I feel like the legislation isn't going far enough to support people that are coming out of our prison industrial complex. He didn't say prison industrial complex, but out of our prison systems to reintegrate into society. And I'm committed more than ever to do more to support folks that are coming back into society. And one of the lessons that I learned, and so this legislation passed 11-0. The mayor did a formal public signing of it, something that he doesn't often do unless it's important legislation. But it reminded me of the important role that we all play to make change in our community and in our society. And it reminds me of the fact that all of us are here because so many people fought for us to be here. It wasn't possible for Gloria, my mothers and grandmothers, to consider running for office or to become a partner at a law firm. Many people fought for us to have a seat at the table. And so no matter what industry you choose to participate in, it's really important that you not take that for granted and you not relinquish the seat that you have at the table. And so I always encourage folks that go into the private sector to sit on their HR committee, to make sure that they're providing a pathway, as Gloria is, for younger women, for younger Asian Americans and other people of color to rise in their firm. And, when I talked to tech companies that moved into San Francisco 10 years ago about what they could do, I said, instead of volunteering for one day out of the year at a soup kitchen, hire just a few folks that wouldn't normally get an opportunity to work at your firm to work at your firm, because that will inevitably create a network in those neighborhoods and communities that normally don't have a track into those jobs that are growing in their own city and their own hometown. And if you do want to volunteer, do volunteer in your community. Actually, the one story I often share is that in Sacramento, we project prison spending based on 3rd grade literacy test scores. We can actually predict how many people will end up in prison in the future by how well our 3rd graders are doing on their literacy tests. So spending 1 hour every week volunteering at your local elementary school to help kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade students catch up on their reading is really significant. And we do have a program at SFUSD that allows adults to come in and volunteer in that way. And I'm sure other school districts do too. So I do really encourage folks to consider Asian American studies if they're undergrads here, but to make it a part of your work, regardless of where you sit as your employment.
Well, that's fascinating, Jane. Thank you for those stats and a kind of a plug for volunteerism, taking chances, and just looking beyond your own career at the moment. So that was fantastic. I learned a lot there. I also wanted to kind of like start asking the audience to start putting their questions in. I'm sure that's something that either Gloria or Jane sparked an interest or a question that you wanted to have answered. We're getting close to the Q&A period. At this point, I know that we probably have some undergrads here and other alumni here that have majored in Asian American Studies. What would your collective advice be to anyone who is selecting majors and selecting careers at this point, Gloria or Jane, in terms of the chances you took and how well it worked out for you? What would your advice be for them today? And also for the university, as some of you may know, the university does not have a department for Asian American Studies, but an interdisciplinary program. And the university is looking at a center for race and ethnic studies. So we're competing for resources for Asian American Studies as a department, along with other studies like Jewish studies and Native American and so on. So what is your insights into selecting the major, propping up a department? Is it fine as a studies as an interdisciplinary major? Gloria or Jane?
I guess I will answer. I guess part of that question is like, what is it also about? What should Stanford do, or what should the alumni do to support Asian American Studies, or is that a separate question?
Oh, you can address that, and I'm sure that
Okay.
John and others on the call can tell you a little bit about what's been happening through the alumni corps. But Gloria, what is your perspective
On that? So kind of similar to what I was saying, I like this idea of an inside job, because I can't make Stanford do anything. I can't make the institution do anything. What I can do is, first of all, we have such an illustrious group of Asian American Studies, and whether they studied or majored in the degree, like, they are doing exceptionally well, many of them, right, financially, and they're also very passionate about Asian American causes, particularly during, kind of that Stop Asian Hate movement. I saw so many of my friends and colleagues, many of them who have super successful exits as tech entrepreneurs or financiers and all of that, really be engaged. And I can see that if we make donations to Stanford, but make sure it's tied to, more programming for Asian American Studies, more support, more resources, obviously more professors and all of that, Stanford will have to listen. I think one of my goals, and I forgot to mention one of my main day jobs, which is a co-founder of Quell Labs. We are a manufacturer, and we get the FDA regulatory approvals for rapid IVD tests for a company in Korea called GenBody. Of course, in my mind, I thought maybe I could have some kind of a big exit. Maybe this could go big. We've had ups and downs, but my goal was like, man, if I could get some money and donate it to, where would I donate it? Of course, first thing is you got to start a super PAC for Jane for whatever she's running for next, right? Then what you do is I would love to donate money to Stanford and say, this is for the Asian American Studies major, and be really focused on that. And they are going to take your money and they are going to allocate it the way you want to, right? So I think if we could pool a lot of our alumni, to do that, that could be very, very impactful. Because at the end of the day, I just feel that the money talks. And, when they see that kind of engagement from the alumni backed by money, I think that's when we can see real movement.
I think Gloria said it perfectly. I think it's really important for Asian American Stanford alumni to be organizing our philanthropy or giving back to the university to make sure that we are really making a difference for our Asian American students and our future leaders of tomorrow at Stanford. I can't tell you how important I think the comparative studies for race and ethnicity program is at Stanford. I think that everyone should take classes with CSRE. It is important to come out as a well-rounded citizen that wants to contribute to their society and be a leader no matter what sector you decide to engage in. And what you learn about our history and our communities of color, I think, is essential to becoming successful as an entrepreneur, as a political leader, as an advocate, because all of us are ultimately engaged in a larger society. None of us work in a vacuum. And I know that it's always hip and cool to say that a diverse company is more successful, a diverse company is going to reach a wider market. But I think regardless of the bottom line, that is the right thing to do because we all live together. And, you know, people often think of the work that I do as altruistic, as selfless, but I always view my work as incredibly selfish because if my neighbors can afford to go to college, if my neighbors have access to early childhood education, if my neighbors can afford housing in the communities that they work in, then I am safer. I am part of a healthier and safer neighborhood and community. So we should all want these things. It's not just to serve others that are not doing as well as us. Our children, our community will all thrive if everyone is better off. And, you know, one thing that we've seen over the last year and a half, 2 years, with the rising spotlight on anti-Asian violence, which has always existed in US history. It is not new, but for whatever reason, although I'm happy, the media is finally paying attention to violence that has been targeted against our community. And in large part, it is because of a complete lack of understanding of Asian American studies and the history of Asian Americans in the United States, and frankly, the history of people of color. And, you know, one of the stories that I learned in Asian American studies is how our communities of color are so intertwined. You know, we talk a lot about the 1964 Civil Rights Act, 1965 Voting Rights Act, and Immigration Acts as these huge milestones in US history. It was people of color that fought for those, along with white allies that have always pushed America to be the country that we stand for, that all people are created equal. Of course, it was at one point all men were created equal, that have driven the US to be the best they could possibly be. And there are positive changes that we have fought for and won. We should not always look on what is happening and be depressed about all the bad things that do happen. There are also wins and there are also setbacks. But I think one thing that people don't know is the history of how those 3 acts were actually passed. And yes, there were good members of Congress that really believed that these were the right things to do. But there are also many members of Congress that at the time were influenced by economics. And for those of you that know, like, this was a time of the Cold War, when the US and the USSR were kind of locked in this battle for the hearts and minds of countries across the world. And communism was actually becoming very popular in countries in Asia and Latin America. And it was the advent of the TV that really highlighted the racism in the United States in the same way that camera phones highlighted Black Lives Matters in the 2010s. Because when the TV came about, it was the first time that people in Asia and Africa and Latin America saw opposing and beatdowns, police beatdowns, government beatdown, dogs on peaceful Black and white protesters. And the USSR used those images to their advantages. They went to countries and leaders and said, why would you want to be a capitalistic country like the United States? This is how they treat people that look like you. And if you read a lot of Asian communist leaders like Ho Chi Minh and Kim Il-sung, they talk a lot about the racism in capitalistic countries like the United States. And what the US started to see, and you'll see this in the congressional records, is that countries started to close their market to US companies in the 60s with these images, because they didn't want to be associated with a racist country. And in fact, many of them did turn to communism, as you know, because of many of the battles that were fought in Asia. And many members of Congress were influenced by the economics to pass legislation to make it appear that the US valued people of color more than they actually appear to. And so, you know, I've always said when, in February, when it's Black History Month, like Black History Month is my history. Like I know that I am partially here because of Black activists that fought, and also that our histories are intertwined, whether it's Gandhi influencing MLK on the nonviolent protest movement, or the international pressure of closing our markets to the United States that helped push the Civil Rights Movement, Immigration Act, Voting Rights Movement, and vice versa. All of this is interlinked together. And this is a kind of history that we need to understand and learn in order to move forward. In fact, much of the anti-Asian violence that occurs from other members, from members of other communities of color, happens because those communities are also not educated on the history of Asian Americans and how we landed in the United States, right? There's a very different narrative of who Asian Americans are, that we're some type of preferred minority, that we get some type of preferred class, and that builds increased tensions between communities of color. So I think that this is so important, and whether you major in this or not, that everyone at Stanford should be taking those classes, because people at Stanford become leaders. They become major contributors to society. And this is incumbent on all of us as citizens of a larger society to understand.
Wow, history lesson. I wish I had done Asian American studies, but you know what? I'm older than you, and that I wouldn't be in your first graduating class. I am going to take this opportunity to spend the next 15 minutes going into Q&A, because I know that Jane has a hard stop in that time frame. So wanted to invite to speak Dwight Hua, who shared in the chat some news about the Center for Comparative Studies on Race and Ethnicity. Dwight, what was the Declaration Day all about, and what was your question?
Yeah, thank you so much for speaking, Gloria and Jane. This is really wonderful. It's really wonderful to see as an undergrad. I'm like a junior majoring in psychology, but minoring in CSRE, and have many of the friends who are majoring in CSRE or in various ethnic studies, as well as Asian American studies. So really appreciate you both. And also someone going into social science, is also great to hear your perspectives and experiences. Yeah, today was actually the Declaration Day that the Center for CSRE held for undergrads to help declare their either major, minor in CSRE, in Asian American studies, in Chicano studies, kind of like all of that day. There was like food, and it was really great. I actually finally declared my minor. I like completed the minor already, but finally declared it. So that was just kind of serendipitous that you know, today was also this, you both were speaking, so I thought it was really cool. And I guess my question is, I think we've kind of talked about it already, and I think people in the chat have kind of voiced this concern around like not having a department in Asian American studies. And as a student, I have definitely felt the effects of not having a department. Literally, our professor, who I love very dearly, for Intro to Asian American Studies, is from he's a faculty member from another school. He's not even a faculty member from Stanford. And everyone who teaches in Asian American Studies, or at least most, are typically by courtesy. Their fields are, they're a professor of English, but they courtesy, teach in Asian American Studies. So I guess like with that frustration, or like, I guess this kind of lack of progress, or I don't know how to describe it, beyond donating and putting pressure and leveraging Stanford to make changes that way, I guess may I ask, like, what other ways can we maybe cooperate as students and alumni to make changes within Stanford, just as like the African and African American Studies program has recently been started at Stanford?
So your question, Dwight, is how do students and alumni work together on this larger issue? John is on the Stanford board. He's a member of class of 93. He put in the chat something that the alumni of his class are doing. So wanted to ask him to maybe address that.
Yeah, hi everyone. It's John Chang, class of 93, one of the SAPAC board members. And Cindy, I actually can't quite take credit for that because, hold on one second. Start your video. Oh, you asked me to start my video. I'm actually walking around kind of prepping dinner, so I don't know if I don't want to
Okay.
get everyone motion sick, but sorry about that. But it was that class, a lot of the people from the class of 91, 92, so a little bit older than me. There were a lot of them who were like my big sibs and leaders in Asian American groups when I was there on campus. But I think that's kind of more of the financial leverage. I think, Dwight, kind of what you're asking, I think one thing I've been seeing in the kind of discussions is, oh, there I am. Just that that the university needs to see demand, and I think that's where students on campus at this time to really make it known that on that level there is a need and a demand from the students on campus for an Asian American Studies major. I think you can make the argument the need for a major in a number of different ways. There's the demand on a societal level from all the kind of racial tensions that we're seeing now. But I think, and Stanford, I think, can always kind of be responsive to that as a progressive institution. But I think when it comes down to nuts and bolts, they want to see students, student demand. And I think it's kind of like a cyclical relationship, if students see that there's resources that Stanford's willing to put in, they see a viable department, it just kind of lends itself. People, freshmen on campus, they show up and say, look at, what are the most popular majors. So I think raising student voices, and that's where kind of working with maybe some of the SAPAC liaisons we have on campus, working with AQC, trying to get an audience with the university membership to really make the demand known.
I think part of that is this PR aspect, right? And that's part of the reason why Jane and I are doing this webinar. You don't have to be scared that you're going to be, broke or not making an impact in the community. There's so many things you can do with the degree. But also, on Jane's Wikipedia page, I would love for it to say, and she was part of the first graduating class of Asian American Studies at Stanford, right? Just to start peppering it in and making it cool, just like Obama did, for community organizers, right? I think one of the most famous Asian American Studies majors is Ali Wong. In her, Netflix special, she talked about being a UCLA Asian American Studies major and kind of poked fun at it, right? But I think when we see more high profile people talk about it and realize, oh no, people are doing just fine and there's so many things you can do with it, it becomes a little bit more mainstream, and it doesn't feel as scary for the parents and students. And then we get the institution itself may not think of it as being just academia or only super liberal thought provoking or whatever, whatever the thought is. I am always thinking about what are the negative aspects and how do we counteract them, right? I would love for the students and alumni to put together maybe a comedy show, bringing Ali Wong in support of Asian American Studies and ticket sales or whatever. Just PR marketing, I think, is a big aspect of that. And maybe that's one of the ways we can approach it as well.
Thank you, Gloria. That's a fantastic idea. And yes, it is important that we acknowledge all the different roles and hats we've had, right? So your signature block isn't your current job, but all the things that you have done up to this point, including being a community organizer, an Asian American Studies major, or a Stanford graduate. So fantastic. Do we have any other questions from the audience? I knew that Linda was going to ask a question, but she had to jump off. Were there any other folks that wanted to ask a question of our illustrious speakers or a comment?
I just wanted to pick up, Gloria, about the comedy event. We actually do have on the board right now, one of our board members is a stand-up comic. And I think we are having a comedy night kind of program coming up in May, hopefully. So yeah, but I think that's a good point, to try and leverage that to turn around. Maybe she has through connections of connections, we can get Ali Wong at an event. That would be great.
Or or Ken Jeong, right? He's from my home state, North Carolina. Yep. So Jane, you put an article in. What is your link all about?
Yeah, so one of the things I served on the San Francisco Board of Education, and one of the ordinances that I was really proud to introduce and pass was bringing ethnic studies curriculum into every single public high school in San Francisco. And one of the unexpected things of the passage of that is that about 5 years later, Stanford did a study on the impact of ethnic studies curriculum in SFUSD. And what they found was that taking a 9th grade ethnic studies course boosted grades, attendance, and course completion rates of SFUSD students who started high school with an academic record that indicated that they would fail. And that struggling students who took ethnic studies went on to compile a C+ average in their freshman year compared with a D average for similar students who didn't take such a course. And Stanford said that they were actually shocked by their own findings, including myself. I passed this ordinance because I thought it was important for students to have access to learning about their own history, particularly in a school district that is 90% students of color and 50% Asian American. But we've learned is that students actually engaging and learning about their history and feeling like what they're learning is actually relevant to who they are and their communities was boosting GPA scores and completion. So I think it's also important for us as alumni and as undergrad to make sure that we're fighting for ethnic studies in our public high schools as well. And I think that that will ultimately boost enrollment in ethnic studies in undergrad because that interest has already been set at a younger age. So getting undergrads to also ensure that, frankly, our Palo Alto public schools have ethnic studies is, I think, just as important. And I agree with Gloria, it's important for us to take those courses because we need to see high enrollment in Asian American studies. And it's really important for alumni and undergrad to organize together. I don't have an answer of how to do that successfully because undergrad is always changing. And I think it's hard for alumni to always know who to contact to do that organizing work together. But I do think it's important for us to work together.
So in the chat, there's been a couple of comments. David Yoon, who says he's in South Korea. That's great, David. Thanks for coming in. That Harvard has committed $45 million to their expansion of the Asian American Studies program, along with others telling us about required ethnic studies at high schools and public schools around the country. I know that SAPAC has 4 committees, one of which is called the Advocacy and Education Committee. And there's a committee under that, a subcommittee called Asian American Studies Committee. And they have about 45 members who have searched across all the universities in the United States, which ones have Asian American Studies, which ones are well-funded, and using that inventory to prepare editorials, op-eds, meetings with the provost and more to push the idea that Asian American Studies as a department belongs at Stanford. We're falling way behind. So if any of you on tonight's call are interested in joining that subcommittee, they meet once a month. They're doing research on the side. They include faculty, staff, and alumni. I'd be happy to put you in touch with either Kevin Sue or Crystal Zhang. So just catch me either on email or in the chat here. David, would you like to share a couple of words since you have just opened up your frame, your video frame?
Yes, I just want to thank Gloria and Jane for sharing your insights, and yeah, I just want to share that about Harvard. You know, it was quite great news last September, and I guess the alum that led that effort is Joseph Bae, who's the co-president of KKR. So yeah, he has I guess deep pockets and rallied other Asian American alumni to contribute. So hopefully that can be I guess an inspiration for Stanford's program.
Thank you, David. So it is 6:29. I've invited everyone who's on the screen with us still to open up their video frames. If we could do like a big group shot, I'm sure this will be wonderful to go with our recording. We'd be happy to share it with the university and other students who are considering Asian American Studies. I want to thank Gloria and Jane for being such amazing, amazing speakers. And not only are you smart and you were the first and you're pioneers, I learned so much from both of you about how to get things done, both from the inside and for being an activist and through policy and through just sheer personal grit. So I applaud both of you. Does anyone have any parting words before we take this quick screenshot? Gloria or Jane or anyone on the call?
I think we're just so thankful for you, Cynthia, for organizing us and moderating us. So otherwise I would have gone nuts. So thanks for keeping me under control. So I appreciate it. So thanks for guiding the
Yeah,
conversation.
thank you so much for organizing this. And I didn't say this, but Gloria is an outstanding and incredible organizer, one of the best I've ever seen. So you don't again have to be in the nonprofit sector to be an organizer and a corraller. This work can happen across multiple sectors, and so grateful to be on this panel and to meet all of you.
Fantastic. Okay, so everyone smile as I get this like what's it, a snipping tool or some kind of screenshot thing going, and I bumped myself out so I can do that. Ready? You're gonna have to smile for like a whole 3 seconds. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Awesome. Great. I got you guys. Thank you so much. Remember to check in on groups.stanford.edu if you're interested in other events or programs. And we hope that we can get back to in-person and that everyone stays safe and has a great spring and a good Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month in May. With that, I'm going to sign off. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.